At its core, classic X-Men took the somewhat cynical practice of reprinting old X-Men comics and turned that crude bit of comics capitalism into something worthwhile. Maybe even something transcendent within the medium. Classic X-Men launched in 1986 as a series featuring reprints of older X-Men issues presented in order, beginning with Giant Size X-Men #1, which was originally published 10 years prior. This practice of reprinting old comics is very nearly as old as comics themselves, and especially familiar to the X-Men franchise, which existed only in the form of reprints from 1970 to 1975. But classic X-Men had something else to offer, something kind of amazing. Each reprinted issue came with a newly written story set in the original era of the reprint. If this sounds confusing, it gets worse. Or better, depending on your love for how convoluted the X franchise can get. Events depicted in the backup stories were then retroactively integrated into the ongoing X-Men continuity, such that a classic X-Men backup story printed in 1988, but set in the X-Men continuity of 1978, could feature details that would then be considered canonical and written into the post-1988 mythology, as if they had always already occurred in the 1978 story. So, if you were to read X-Men Annual number 12 for 1988, for example, and find yourself wondering why you don't recall when Storm met a transdimensional Sky Fox named Kajimi, or when Colossus conceived a son with Nereel of the Fall People, you'd have to look for those answers in Classic X-Men number 21 and 22, which chronicled both of these events as supplemental snippets to the new X-Men's first visit to the Savage Land, which was originally published without Luck Dragon bonding or T-Rex carcass adjacent threesome way back in 1978. This strategy of retroactive continuity editions is made more palatable due to the simple fact that the writer from 1978 is the same in 1988. But even so, this approach to continuity is somewhat experimental and compelling to study for its own sake, even without the otherwise unpublished important moments that became the subject of these stories, such as Magneto's origin story, the forming of the Starjammers, the exact nature of the Phoenix Force's offering to Jean, Mastermind's slow seduction of Jean, the sexual threat that Logan presented to Jean's relationship, and many more deeply important moments in the history of X-Men continuity. But the contributions to X-Men continuity are about much more than plot details. The classic X-Men stories emphasized intimate character portraits over the usual group action dynamic of Uncanny X-Men. With space to breathe and hindsight to guide his perspective, Claremont would often isolate one or two X-Men characters and build a narrative that provided key insights into the depth of their character, even retrospectively. Where the usual comics grind only allowed Claremont to provide glimpses of these relationships, the classic X-Men backups allowed him to fully and finally portray dynamics, like the extent of Jean's love and desire for Scott, the formation of her sisterly friendship with Aurora, or Wolverine's sympathy and understanding for Kurt, leading to an important mentorship around identity politics. This emphasis on character is ably met by a more intimate artistic style provided by John Bolton. Bolton's distinctive artwork moves away from the house style of Marvel at the time, invoking instead a hyper-realist, photographic style that gives the characters a sense of presence and realization that added a visual depth to each character to match the narrative depth of Claremont's vignettes. Outside of Bolton's contributions to the classic X-Men aesthetic, the series also boasts some truly remarkable cover artwork, including 22 issues by Art Adams, 22 by Steve Lytle, and 14 by a pre-Hellboy Mike Mignola, with each artist providing a unique essentialization of iconic X-Men stories and moments, informed once again by the value and perspective of hindsight. Comic book reprints are, by tradition, worth just about as much as the paper that they're printed on, except in very rare circumstances. But the backup stories in classic X-Men defy that assumption, offering readers a uniquely anachronistic experience in retroactive continuity, enabled and empowered by Claremont's long tenure on the X-Men franchise. These are some of the best stories he ever wrote, some of the best X-Men stories ever put to paper. The publishing purpose is perhaps cynical, and the chronology certainly confusing, but classic X-Men was a unique and important moment in the history of this franchise, and when we consider how wholly unlikely the circumstances empowering it were, maybe in the history of the comics medium in general. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to learn more about our project, you can follow us on the web at www.claremontrun.com or on Twitter at ClaremontRun.